Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay. So our next speaker is Ari LiVigni. It starts to be boring to announce speakers as Red Hatters. So I'll add that before working for Red Hat, Ari worked for VMware. Ari is working within QE on projects related to CI, on CI infrastructure, CI tools, and his talk will be also focused on CI. Ari, go ahead.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about CI provisioner. My name's Ari LiVigni. I'm on part of the QE Ops team. Before I get started on my presentation, just to say the first two questions gets some T-shirts from the conference.
What does CI stand for?
You have to wait to the end. But thanks for participating. So I'm going to go through some of the features of the CI provisioner, what this project defaults, which is kind of the tenant side for the Openstack and Foreman of when you're provisioning the resources. And then I'm going to talk about different topologies of how to set that up. They're basically JSON files, and there's different types. So I'm going to talk about different ones. I'm also going to talk about kind of some configuration management that you can add to the topology files and kind of set up your infrastructure more than just provisioning the resource itself. And the other part too is it's disconnected from Jenkins, but it also can be integrated very easily. That's kind of how I designed it, not to be a plugin or be completely dependent on Jenkins. And then I'm going to do some just walkthroughs of the inputs of the JSON files and what comes out after the provisioning is done. And then I'll also talk about Jenkins Job Builder, which is very key if you are using Jenkins of setting this up. It's a really handy tool. It's an upstream tool developed by Openstack, and I use it heavily. And just talk about some of the execution futures and just some references at the end. So let's get started with that. So you can provision Jenkins masters with this tool. So in an OpenStack environment, very easy to set up and provision and get everything you want, set up even plugins and packages and things like that. Same for the Jenkins slaves and also any test resources. Mainly the Jenkins masters and slaves are to be provisioned in OpenStack. Test resources can be in OpenStack, Foreman, or Beaker. And my intent is also to get the slaves, it's in progress right now, to use Docker to provision Docker containers as well as test resources. The global and project defaults are kind of what define the framework of your environment. So what is your OpenStack instance? What does that look like? What's the API endpoint, username, password, things like that, or key pair. And that's what's managed by the global and project defaults. And the topology files are really what describes your resources, whether they're Jenkins slaves or they're test resources. It helps you kind of describe, the images that are in OpenStack, or maybe it's a Foreman image or a bare metal machine, or is it a Beaker? You need a Beaker resource of a certain type of architecture. And the way that I designed, just to add for the Beaker part, it's really dedicated to provisioning bare metal resources, since you can get the OpenStack, you can use OpenStack to get the virtual resources. And the other good thing when you're provisioning these resources is that the SSH keys are passed between. So your master, slave, test resources can all talk to each other, so that you don't need username and passwords or any kind of other authentication. And we try to test the code. We use Gerrit with reviews, obviously, and then a gate job picks up any new code before it's been committed to validate that we haven't broken the world and everything is working. We always are trying to enhance the testing. So, yeah. Next slide. So, like I said, the project defaults is really what describes the OpenStack tenant. Since you have specifics for your tenant in OpenStack. You don't have access to the entire OpenStack environment. Any Foreman credentials, version, and kind of the OS mapping of your partition tables and media can all be described in the project defaults. And you can also have a general fallback resources, which I'll talk about in the topology files. The fallback resources is just like if you do not define anything in the topology, it'll be picked up in the fallback of the project defaults. And I can show you. I don't know if you guys can see that. You need me to make it bigger. So this kind of describes the resources at the top, very simple as the fallback. And this is what describes the instances, your tenant resource in OpenStack, or your Foreman. You can obviously fill in all these values to your specific instance, whether it's Foreman or OpenStack. And that's kind of that about the project defaults. So like I said, the topology files can be a mix of, you can, in one topology file, you can describe, 4 Beaker resources, 2 OpenStack resources, and a Foreman if you wanted to. And all of them are described in JSON, and some things that are common between all the different infrastructures that you can provision in is you can use metadata, which is a key value pair that maybe there's a certain key value pair you want to pass through to the resources at the end after you actually get the IP addresses or the machine names. You can have that as a reference for the different machines and indicate which machine is which. And then you can also specify a count, so you don't have to duplicate blocks of JSON. You can just say, I want 4 of the same thing. So that's common throughout, and I'll talk about that more when we get to the resources part. And it's just an array of resources that it goes through to provision. And like I said, the topology overrides. If there was something defined, like I showed you in the project defaults, the topology files will override whatever was defined there for the specific resource. So the typical kind of OpenStack, if you're familiar with OpenStack, which I'm sure many people in here are, you have this name, image. I also support Cloud Init, so if you had some references to maybe some Cloud Init files, I will walk through those files when it gets provisioned and actually execute any of the cloud initialization files. And flavor, obviously, if you want small, medium, large, or whatever is defined on your OpenStack instance, it can be anything there. I'll walk through those examples in a minute. I'm just going to talk about, so Foreman, you also have the idea of you can reference host groups or prefixes of hosts or specific host names if you want to rebuild or reserve them. And Beaker resources, you have a job group, anything that's typically in an XML recipe set today. We are in that recipe set block, which I'll show an example of. And the job group can be your team's group that you have resources dedicated to that you want to reference. And the skip max attempts, actually, what we normally do is wait 60 minutes per resource that has been provisioned in Beaker. But if you don't want to have us wait, skip max attempts will just either have Beaker control that. You could use Jenkins and time it out in a job and just time it out that way. Or maybe you have your own mechanism that you want to use to time it out. So I'll walk through the OpenStack examples. So this is typical JSON. There's the resources block. Indicates a flavor. I have a default name in there. You can always override that too. If you wanted more than one of those, you could specify that, your flavor, image, and the metadata that I described to you before, where you could have some key value pair that means something that you want at the back end after you provision the resources. This is a more complicated OpenStack where I'm provisioning 2 of this type of image in a flavored medium, and I'm provisioning a large and that image, 2 of those as well. So it just shows you how you can have multiple in the same block. And So Foreman, very similar also, but I specified a specific host name that I wanted to reserve and reinstall. Just some other examples, but these are typical. So the reserve and rebuild are kind of the key terms for the Foreman and host names. If you could also specify host groups here or prefix, so if you wanted any machine that matches, Loki, just that beginning name, you could do that and it would search through and just provision anything that matches that in Foreman when it talks to it. And last but not least is Beaker. So Beaker, like I said, anything today, like you can put an XML to define, for recipe sets, architecture, these kind of different things you can put in that block. And then the other things outside of that, like I said, are the job group, or if you wanted that skip max attempts, you could have that there. And here I'm provisioning 2. I put the count up here. But what I could do also is in the recipe set, if I actually didn't want different ones, I could take this part out, and the count would then just duplicate for this one that was defined here. So that kind of defines like the things that you're going to provision, in the different infrastructures. And now I'm going to talk about some of the configuration management things that you can do once you've provisioned it. So I allow you to kind of just give, paths to Ansible playbooks, and I will execute those against the resource. Ansible's obviously installed, and it's using the Python APIs for that. And then also, if you wanted to, you could specify if there's any additional repos that you wanted to use besides what's already laid out on the image. You could add those by providing that. And then also, if there are specific packages, whether they're Python packages right now I support and Yum packages, and I'll show you examples of those. So first, the Ansible example. So here I have some references to a couple of playbooks that do some basic, configuration inside the system. And you can just it'll just execute those once you've provisioned the machine. So once the machine is up and running, it will then execute this as a follow-on task. And everything here is based on this, it's an open source project actually developed here in Brno called Task Runner by some folks from the ROS team. And that's what allows me to kind of do these different tasks of provisioning, executing Ansible playbooks, or as you can see below, this is an example of adding repos. So here, obviously, I'm just using name and base URL or mirror list, but you could add JPG check or things like that, those other options as part of what you would have when you add a repo as if you were on the machine. And you could add that here. And then what I would do is just add those repos to each one of the machines that's been provisioned. And then, actually, if I just show you the repos and the packages. So let me see if it's, sorry, it's further down. There we go. So this, I already kind of explained the repos. But here, I wanted to install some Yum packages in addition to what's already on the machine. Or I wanted to add Jenkins Job Builder as a pip package in addition to that after it provisions the machine. So you could obviously do these things as part of Ansible playbooks. You don't have to use this, but I thought this was a nice mechanism just to have as a simple way, like I just want to add repos, I just want to add packages and install them, and just gives you an easy JSON interface to do that. So this is kind of just this is what I just showed you, pretty much the JSON file itself, pretty basic. You can probably skip through that. So at the end of it all, when things are provisioned, you kind of want something back from that. You want whether it's in Jenkins or it's on your system, you want, okay, what did I actually provision? What's my IP address? What's my host name? What am I getting out of that? So we provide these two files, kind of a resource, this resources.txt, which is here. And these are just kind of regular environment variables. We use them in Jenkins to then pass them along to other jobs. And then what I also kind of noted here is, in here, if it actually is run in Jenkins, we filled in the job name and build number for you as part of an environment variable. And then this also shows you kind of just a comma-separated list of existing nodes. The private IPs really are just referencing if they're an OpenStack resource. That doesn't really apply to Beaker or Foreman. What site they were provisioning. If this was a Beaker job, it would also list that. And this is more this kind of is put here if you're using a naming in the topology versus you're putting it on the command line. I'll explain that a little bit later. Besides that file that gets returned, which is kind of, it's good for an environment, but you kind of maybe want to read something or walk through something that's a little bit more descriptive. So this file is what you actually get back after you've provisioned something. So I have the same kind of information. Here's my IP address, my private IP, and there's the metadata that I was telling you about. So you passed it through at the original topology file in the beginning, and then it comes out at the end. So if there's, say, I wanted this machine to be the server and I wanted this other machine to be a client, you could kind of use that key value pair as an example. And you get the full name of the system. What we do too when we provision the systems in OpenStack is the names we add a UUID to the name and the resources to separate it and make them unique. This is also just to tell you similar to what we do these are more test resources, but Jenkins slaves are done the same way. So Jenkins Job Builder, what I like about it, it takes kind of simple descriptions of your Jenkins jobs. You can make many jobs at a very small amount of YAML. It's a YAML format. And you can describe, 100 jobs with probably, 10 or 20 lines of YAML, which is pretty powerful. It's also good because then you can check that into your code base. You can keep it under source control. You don't have to have it in a Jenkins instance through the UI. I find that if you have a lot of jobs, managing them through the UI or even the API becomes kind of cumbersome. This allows you to kind of do it a lot easier. And the templating system, the way it works is really, really pretty slick. I'm going to show you some examples. You can integrate that with any test harness and XUnit format. Jenkins supports XUnit format, so if your test harnesses or tests are producing XUnit at the end of the day, it integrates very well with the plugins with Jenkins Job Builder and Jenkins, as well as the provisioner. So this is an example of like a job template where I'm defining these three jobs. One is to provision. One is, I'll scroll down. One is actually calling the provisioner here at the top to do the provisioning. We're publishing some results and triggering other jobs. On failure, we're going to tear that down. If there was some issue with provisioning the resource, we tear it down. If there is success, then we move on to running a test, which is this job. The key thing with these, the curly brackets, the key thing to note is these are basically macros. That's what Jenkins Job Builder calls them. So you can very easily, down here, you can create multiple jobs by using these macros up above, and when it goes to run Jenkins Job Builder against Jenkins, it'll create all those jobs with all these identical things that you want. So this way you avoid kind of the typos or things like that when you're on the UI, or that always happens. And then you can define other things like specifically the slave images if you wanted to do something like that. This is how I used it. And then I can just replace this up above in all of my jobs. And it just becomes for me, it becomes an easier way to maintain what's going on in my Jenkins jobs. I don't have to worry that one job is slightly different than another if it's controlled in this. So that was kind of description of the jobs, and what I wanted to show you now is, real briefly, is you can set up many defaults. So if you have a lot of jobs that it's like all these, I'm using all these Git repos, I'm using all these kind of wrappers, you can define a bunch of defaults and just reference them. So in that other file, this name here, like CI workflow provision, this is the one. You can just reference this default name here. And then anything that was defined in there for the different sections of a Jenkins job, like SCM or triggering or wrappers, can be defaulted in one file and used throughout, but you don't have to duplicate that code. And it's all in YAML, pretty easy to read. So this is kind of, I know it's probably a little hard to read, but this kind of just shows how you can use the provisioner, whether you had static slaves, so you maybe had slaves that or bare metal or VMs that you keep around that you want to use as slaves, you can do that and run your testing. Or you could do a dynamic provision of a slave. So that's what also the provisioner allows you to do, is not just provision the test resource, but let's say you need a Jenkins slave in addition to do the work, and you don't want to put your load on your master, you can pull that resource out of OpenStack and then easily run your tests on that slave, and then you'll have a test resource that you've provisioned, and then at the end of the day, you would tear that down. Maybe you want to keep the slave around, that's also possible. That's an option. Or you can run here, like I was saying, either on the Jenkins master or a static slave, and you could just provision the test resource. Or maybe your test resource is the slave, so it could be a slave and a test resource. That's what this option is. And at the end of it, you can just basically decide what pieces you want to tear down. If you want to keep the dynamic slave around, great, it's not a problem. Or if you want to, and most likely at the end of the day, you want to tear down your test resource unless there's a failure. Maybe you want to keep it around for a certain amount of time. And I can go back to this at the end if people have questions about this slide in particular. So it's pretty basic kind of shell command line. It's calling task runner underneath it all. But these are just some of the settings that allow you to set up for provisioning a slave. Maybe you want to set the name, what master you want to attach to, your path to your Jenkins CLI. Some of these are already defaulted, so you don't have to provide them. Or you could define these in your topology file, and it will pull it out of that. So it gives you the option to do it on the command line, which will supersede what's in the topology file, or just use what's in the topology file. This is for provisioning resources. So again, you're kind of giving where's the path to my project defaults that defines my infrastructure, where's my topology file that defines what resources I'm going to provision, the SSH key that you want to put across all the machines that you're provisioning. You can specify a resource file, or by default, we just use the resources.json file that I showed you earlier. And if you don't want to add a UUID to the end, you can provide that option. And you can define a specific workspace if you wanted to. And the cleanup just says if you have the option to clean up if there was a failure or a success I want to clean up. There's different options there that in different cases you might want to clean up versus not cleaning up. And that kind of defines how to execute. So the future, I'm in the process of upstreaming this called CI Factory to take all the stuff that I've kind of developed in-house and make it more general. I'm pretty much like halfway through that, so that should be out soon. And then the idea is I'd like to use Docker containers for Jenkins slaves, which is already possible, but I like to provision them. And I was thinking of actually using Atomic as the base image in OpenStack and then putting Docker containers on that for Jenkins slaves or possibly test resources. And while Task Runner has been useful, it has certain limitations. So I was looking at reevaluating and replacing that with Fabric to talk to the different machines. And then also I'd like to eventually provision this and have an option to provision EC2. So if you're out of resources in your OpenStack environment or Foreman, you could maybe, at least for virtual resources, go out to Amazon and you've already paid for the resources, you could use those as an option. So that kind of sums it up. These are just some links. Just general Jenkins Job Builder, which is out there. It's open source. Task Runner, the Ansible API. Beaker is also open source. And the Foreman Python API is what we use to talk to Foreman. And please provide feedback on the link here. I don't know if I'm open for questions if you wanted to jump in any specifics about any part of the provisioner. Any questions? T-shirts. T-shirts. Go ahead. I'm sorry, can you say that again?
You said previously that you can provision Jenkins clusters.
Yes.
But how do you do this? Because when you provision Jenkins cluster, you install a package and you need to configure it. And the problem is that you have no tools to do it properly. So do you just put configure XML in place as a file, or you do some configuration of the Jenkins cluster afterwards?
We do so the question was how do we configure Jenkins master after it's been provisioned. So we provisioned a resource, but now what do you do to actually set up Jenkins? So we do obviously the installation of Jenkins. The configuration is done both with a little bit of changing of the XML, but also running some Groovy scripts to get things in place. So it's just like setting up environment variables and things like that. Great question. And there is...
I'm trying to use Jenkins Job Builder on my project.
Yeah.
So as of now, I think you guys have got a couple of GitHub repos where the CI ops and other one, and you just install from Jenkins install or something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
I think it's better to give us RPMs so you can have actually dependency on each other. So it should be easy for us to kind of just one command and get all this stuff.
Sure. So the question he would like to see, right now the installation is through Git repo, but you'd like to see your RPM package of it. It's a good idea. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think there is a control repo with Jenkins Builder.
Okay. But you're talking specifically about the provisioner part, right? That if you had an RPM of that to roll out, yeah.
All the stuff to basically do the whole CI stuff, right? Starting from provisioner to message bus and task, whatever required.
Have it packaged up, yeah.
Item to the wish list. Do you plan to add support for migrating existing jobs to job templates? I don't mean not completely creating templates for existing job, but at least create, if I have quite complex, lot of quite complex jobs, so some tool which will scan through it and create at least part of the template, so I don't have to write everything from scratch.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the question is, do we have something to convert existing Jenkins jobs, like the XML format, into YAML that's already in the Jenkins Job Builder format? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, the new template which you mentioned, it's the proper way how to manage the jobs.
Yeah.
It looks pretty reasonable to me, so I would like to go this way, but
There's no right. I haven't looked into that, but that's an option. It sounds even something maybe separate outside of the provision, but a tool that can do that conversion. It probably would need something around it though to make sure like what are defaults, what are I think it probably would need some input from the user, but it's possible probably to convert that XML to the YAML format easily.
How many Jenkins plugins you need actually for provisioning Jenkins?
So for provisioning just the master. So the question is, what plugins do you need for provisioning the Jenkins master? So when we provision the masters, we have some default plugins we already provide and we set up out of the box. And we also give you an option to add additional plugins. There's also a list of kind of base plugins that you can install, and that's an option, or you could do the full gamut of our plugins. We try to, since it's part of Central CI, we try to install a base or a nice set of plugins that will allow you to use Jenkins Job Builder and carry out like the XUnit stuff or email or all those pieces. And also like our message bus, we have a CI trigger that also is installed. That's right now is an upstream, but there's a plan to do that as well. But right now, when we deploy a Jenkins master, we have a set of plugins that we put out there. Yeah. Sure.
Provision your slaves for test or something. Do you run any previous test run before you actually switch it into your test environment, CI environment? Like when I just set up my server and before I run the test which will actually test something, I usually want to run the empty test which will check if the server is set up in the proper way. Do you do something like this?
So the question is, do we do any kind of pre-checks when we deploy the Jenkins slave? We don't today. The idea is the Jenkins slave image that's in Openstack either already has all the things you need in it, so it's already set up and it should be already configured to your liking, since it's an image in Openstack. But you could also take a bare image and then install a bunch of stuff as part of it, and maybe you could, in your Jenkins Job Builder, define something that runs before your real test does to just validate it. You could actually add that yourself as part of that in Jenkins Job Builder. And just to note, I know we're talking a lot about Jenkins, but like I said before, you could run these scripts from your command line if you had the resources and you had everything set up. That's actually how I do it all the time. I don't always run it through Jenkins. I run it on my command line just to validate the resources that I'm provisioning is what I expect to get at the end of it. Any other questions?
How do you handle multi-tenancy?
Multi-tenancy?
Yeah, I mean, how do you isolate jobs and users within jobs within a product? Like, do you not need to because it's an internal?
Are you saying from the OpenStack standpoint or then Jenkins?
Assume there's 3 people who are using this particular infrastructure. How does the user have a reasonable, how do you get reasonable confidence that he gets similar infrastructure every time? For example, if I'm doing a network performance test, how do I know that somebody else's infrastructure isn't perfect?
So the question is there kind of almost like isolation of resources between teams? So by doing the multi-tenancy, if you're using the OpenStack resources or Foreman, you get that automatically because the project defaults that I described is specific for your team. So you could set that up in your own OpenStack instance and say, I'm carving up these tenants and I'm going to use these resources, and this is the access for that specific tenant. That's how you do it from OpenStack. For Beaker, you get the machine yourself. So once you reserve it, it's yours, so it's not a problem in that case.
So then it will be, at what stage do the resources actually get provisioned? I mean, is it up to the Jenkins job to make the call to the CI provision and say, hey, I need like 40 VMs? Or is that done when the job is set up and then there is active?
So in that YAML that I showed you, which I can go back to, but that YAML, it's done in that job itself as part of the shell. It's just calling the provisioner. And when that job is complete and you have the resources.json file and resources.txt, it's been provisioned and it's yours to use.
And it's done fresh every job, right?
Yes. Yeah. And like I said, I mean, in some cases you might want to keep your Jenkins slave around so you don't have to rip it down. But usually most people do want like a fresh, clean environment, so they'll do that, especially if maybe the test resource is the Jenkins slave. So you set that up and tear it down every time just so you have a clean environment. Any other questions?
So how do you handle failures? Say, for example, Foreman had a problem reading the machine. What do you get? What the user of the API gets out
Yeah, so the question is, what kind of error handling basically do we get out of when we're running the provisioner? So Task Runner does a good job of bubbling up any errors and are pretty descriptive on what failed. So let's say I had a repo that doesn't exist, or I somehow configured it wrong when I tried to add it, or there's a package that didn't install. That information gets bubbled out and standard out to you with a standard error and exit codes with all the details of what happened, and you get that as part of the console in Jenkins, or right on your command window if you're running it locally. Yeah. Any other questions? Great. Well, thanks a lot for coming. Appreciate it. T-shirts. You guys.